Good evening, and thank you for lending us your ears tonight. It's time for Mimi and Pico TV.
Welcome, everyone.
You know, I had this really interesting chat with a professor the other day, and it started with something that seems, well, pretty basic about Japanese.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
Just the word order. We were talking, and they just stopped and said something like, "It's funny, isn't it? The verb. It always comes at the end. It feels completely backward."
Yes. That's probably the number one thing that trips people up when they first start learning Japanese. It feels counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Totally. Like you're reading a mystery novel, and the whodunit is the very last word of the book.
That's a good way to put it.
And the professor, they weren't just talking about, the grammar rule. It was more like they were surprised by what that means, how it might shape the way people talk or even think. It felt like this tiny rule opened up a huge door.
You've really zeroed in on something fascinating there. Because what seems like just a simple grammatical choice, sticking the verb at the end, it's actually, well, our sources suggest it's this quiet but incredibly intelligent practice.
Intelligent? How so?
Well, it profoundly influences how speakers perceive things, how they interact, how they build relationships. It's much more than just syntax, really. It's like a little window into a whole different kind of cultural mindset.
Okay, now I'm really curious. It sounds like my professor and I were just scratching the surface. So for this deep dive, let's use the sources you've gathered, the articles, the research, and really dig into why.
It sounds like a plan.
Why does Japanese put the verb last? What does the structure, the seemingly small detail tell us about communication, about culture, maybe even about different ways of thinking? And I saw something in the notes about AI.
Yes, that too. It even poses challenges for artificial intelligence. It all connects back.
So our mission today, unpack the verb last structure, explore what it reveals about human connection itself using all this material we have.
An excellent mission. Let's jump in.
Okay, so let's start with that basic puzzle, the thing that gets everyone. Why is the verb, the action word, hiding at the very end of Japanese sentence? It feels like you're building suspense constantly.
Right. It is absolutely the most common point of, let's say, confusion and curiosity for learners, especially if you're coming from English or many European languages. It just feels inverted.
Yeah.
So let's break it down simply like our source material does. Most major world languages, think English, French, Spanish, even Chinese, they generally follow a subject-verb-object pattern. SVO, we call it.
Right, like I eat sushi, subject, verb, object, simple.
Yeah, exactly. I, subject, eat, verb, sushi, object. The action, the verb, comes nice and early. It makes the meaning pretty clear pretty quickly. It's linear. You get the main point up front.
You know what's happening almost straight away.
Precisely. Very direct.
All right.
Now, Japanese flips that around mostly. It uses subject-object-verb, SOV.
SOV.
So I eat sushi becomes, well, structurally more like I sushi eat. In Japanese, watashi wa sushi o tabemasu.
I sushi eat. Huh. It still sounds a bit odd, doesn't it, when you translate it directly like that?
It does to our English-tuned ears. And that's the core of it. You state the subject, I, then you bring in the object, sushi, maybe some other details about time and place. But the verb, the eat, the crucial part that tells you what's actually being done.
It's held back.
It's held back right until the very, very end. One of the American learners quoted in our source described it perfectly. They said it's like holding the punchline until the very end of the joke.
Holding the punchline. I love that. That really captures the feeling, that sense of waiting.
It really does. And it's more than just a keiki phrase. It points to the effect on the listener because the key information, the action, the conclusion is suspended. You, the listener, you have to pay attention to everything that comes first.
You can't zone out.
Not really, no. You need to listen all the way through to understand the complete thought. You're constantly taking in the context the speaker is building, holding it all in your head until that final verb clicks everything into place.
So it demands active listening from beginning to end. You're not just waiting for the main point, you're absorbing the whole setup.
Absolutely. Reading the context right up until the final moment. It requires a different kind of mental engagement compared to SVO, where you might get the core information much sooner.
Okay, so that's the basic mechanics. But you mentioned earlier, and the sources touch on this, that initial view some people had, like that US professor who thought it was inefficient.
Right.
Or maybe even not suited for logical thinking. Was that a common reaction from people used to SVO languages?
Oh, definitely. That perspective was quite prevalent, especially in, let's say, Western linguistic circles that historically valued directness, clarity, kind of step-by-step logic. SVO fits that model quite well.
And this professor actually lectured on it being inefficient.
He did. He gave a lecture arguing exactly that Japanese was inefficient, maybe not ideal for purely logical thought, precisely because it delays the main action, the conclusion. He saw it as a hindrance, a lack of precision.
Wow. That seems, well, a bit presumptive looking back.
It does now, perhaps. But here's where the story in our source gets really interesting. This professor's view didn't just soften, it completely flipped. It underwent a radical change.
Really? How?
It wasn't overnight. It happened over about 10 years. A whole decade of serious research. But more importantly, living and working in Japan, immersed in the language and culture.
10 years. Okay, something must have really clicked for him then. What did he discover?
He realized that the word order wasn't just some, grammatical oddity. He saw it was deeply woven into the fabric of communication itself, the style of speaking, and even the underlying way people seem to think and relate to each other.
So not just rules, but behavior.
Exactly. What really struck him, what was the turning point, was observing his Japanese students in actual conversation. Their communication style just wasn't what he expected.
How were they different? What did he notice?
Well, this is fascinating. He saw they weren't rushing to get to their main point, their opinion, their conclusion. Not at all. Instead, they would patiently, sometimes quite meticulously, build up the context first.
Laying the groundwork.
Precisely. They'd set the scene, offer background details, maybe mention related circumstances, and all the while, they were subtly, constantly observing the listener.
Watching the listener.
While talking.
Yeah. Gauging their understanding, sensing their reaction, kind of reading the room, you could say. They were checking for comprehension, for empathy, before quietly adding the final piece, the verb, the conclusion, right at the end.
So it wasn't just talking at someone. It was more like feeling the way together.
Yeah.
Adjusting based on the listener's vibes.
You've got it. He started describing it less like a Western-style debate, which is often about quick assertion and counter-assertion.
Right, jumping in.
And more like a kind of dialogue performance. Or even, I think this is a lovely phrase from the source, a co-creation. The meaning wasn't just delivered. It was built collaboratively, with the listener being brought along every step of the way, making sure they were on the same page before the final revelation. Co-creation. I like that. It sounds much more connected. Okay, so how does the verb last structure specifically encourage that? What's the actual link between the grammar and this careful listener-aware style?
Well, think about it. The SOV structure almost forces the speaker to consider the listener right from the start. By putting the verb last, you're essentially asking for their patience, their trust. You're saying, okay, here's the situation, here are the details, stick with me, the conclusion is coming.
It's like an implicit request to listen fully.
Exactly. It's not about being intentionally obscure. It's about ensuring the listener has the full picture, the necessary context, before they get that final meaning-defining verb. It naturally encourages providing that context first.
So it builds the foundation for understanding before delivering the main point.
Yes, it carves out a deliberate space for the listener within the sentence's flow. And our sources argue this points to something deeper about conversation itself. Maybe it's not just about firing opinions back and forth. Maybe there's real value, a kind of quiet intelligence in taking the time to receive not just the words, but the whole thought process, the feeling, the context behind the final statement. The grammar itself nudges speakers towards creating that richer environment.
So the language structure kind of prioritizes the listener's journey through the thought, not just the end point.
Beautifully put. It frames communication as a shared experience. And the argument is, this isn't random. The structure of a language, the patterns it imposes, reflects the very shape of thinking of its speakers. The Japanese SOV structure, by delaying that conclusion, quietly embeds this unique intelligence that values connection, context, and the subtle dance between speaker and listener.
This really makes me think of that idea, Sapir-Whorf, the hypothesis that language shapes thought. Does that fit in here?
Absolutely, you're right on track. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, from linguists Edward Sapir and Benjamin Whorf, is exactly relevant. It suggests quite powerfully that the grammar and vocabulary of your language don't just describe your reality, they actively influence, maybe even structure, how you perceive and make sense of the world.
So the language isn't just a tool, it's like the lens you see through.
Or even part of the architecture of the world you experience. It's a profound idea.
Yeah.
So applying this to Japanese, the SOV structure isn't just a rule you follow. The argument is that it cultivates a different way of processing information and approaching interaction. It subtly encourages focusing on the relationship, the context, building that shared understanding before you get to the final point.
That's a huge implication. Okay, let's dig into that difference in thinking style more. If SVO encourages one style and SOV another, how does that actually feel? How might Japanese thinking shaped by SOV differ from, say, English thinking shaped by SVO?
Okay, let's contrast them directly. In SVO languages, like English, you get subject-verb right away. I think that, she decided.
We need to.
The structure itself pushes you to state your position, your action, your core idea very early on.
Get straight to the point.
Exactly. The thinking often feels linear, like you're drawing a straight line from A to B, from subject to action, from premise to conclusion. It's very efficient for stating facts, opinions, decisions directly.
Clear and fast.
Right. Now, flip to SOV Japanese. You start with the subject, watashi wa. But then comes stuff, context. Dokino no yoru, last night. Tomajichitu, with a friend. Taki no chikaku de, near the station. You're painting this detailed picture, this environment.
Setting the stage.
Before finally the verb arrives. Amishikita, met. The mental process for constructing that sentence is totally different. You have to map out the context first.
You do. You need the whole backstory before the main event.
And the argument from our sources is that this translates into a different flow of thought. If SVO is that street arrow, SOV thinking is maybe more like navigating a landscape. You're moving forward, but you're constantly scanning around, taking in the surroundings, considering the relationships, adjusting your path based on what you see and sense.
Like walking through a garden instead of down a highway.
That's a nice image. It's described in one source as thinking while pausing. It's a thinking style that seems to naturally incorporate consensus building, or at least ensuring shared understanding as part of the process, rather than just delivering a verdict.
Thinking while pausing. It sounds less about winning an argument and more about, well, understanding. More observant, maybe.
It does lean that way. There's this constant, almost subconscious attention to how the listener is receiving things, their potential reaction, the vibe. It creates this unique sort of tremor or resonance between speaking and listening. It fosters this deep attitude that language isn't just a tool you wield, but something you nurture together, speaker and listener, moment by moment. The grammar encourages it.
It's amazing. A simple rule having such deep ripples. Now, the source also brings in a famous philosopher, Wittgenstein, and that quote about language limiting our world. How does he fit into this picture?
Yeah, Ludwig Wittgenstein, hugely influential philosopher of language. And yes, that quote, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world."
Okay, what does that really mean, simply put? That we can only think about things we have words for?
It's a bit deeper than just vocabulary. It suggests the structure of your language, its grammar, its categories, actively shapes how you perceive reality itself. What you notice, what connections you make, what feels possible or logical, it's all filtered through and partly constructed by your language. It's not just a mirror reflecting the world, it's also the lens, maybe even the framework.
Wow. Okay, so applying that to Japanese SOV.
If Wittgenstein is right, then the world presented or constructed by the Japanese language is inherently different from one presented by an SVO language like English. It's not just a sequence of facts or actions laid out linearly.
What is it then?
Our source suggests it's more like a relationship landscape. A world where meaning isn't just in the individual statements, but in the connections, the context, the shared space between speaker and listener. You arrive at the conclusion together, feeling the atmosphere, sensing the relationship dynamics, reading the context as much as the words.
A relationship landscape that connects right back to that idea of co-creation you mentioned.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
And you see this reflected in behavior too, as the source notes. That tendency for Japanese speakers to often assess the situation first. Who am I talking to? What's the mood? Should I even say this now? The deep consideration for the social environment. It's perfectly mirrored in a language structure where the conclusion waits, letting the context settle first.
Which is so different from cultures where maybe the goal is to get your point across loudest or fastest.
Exactly. While some language structures might facilitate immediate self-assertion, this approach, delaying the conclusion, building context, prioritizing the listener, uses language less as a tool of competition, as the source puts it, and more as a bridge of empathy. That's the quiet intelligence, the philosophy embedded in the structure, that someone like Wittgenstein would likely find fascinating. It hints at a different purpose for language, maybe about simply being together better.
Language as a bridge of empathy. Built right into the grammar. Okay, that's profound. And it leads nicely to another story from the source. This English-speaking scholar learning Japanese who first found it roundabout.
Ah, yes, that feeling again.
Right, but then he had this big realization about what the language is actually doing to him, what it was training. What was that insight?
Well, his initial feeling was common. SOV feels indirect if you're used to SVO. Why take the scenic route? But as he spent more time really using the language, engaging in conversations, he had this aha moment. He realized that maybe Japanese isn't primarily structured to optimize speaking in the sense of rapid, clear assertion. Instead, he concluded, it might be a language uniquely designed to train the listening ability.
Training the ear more than the mouth. How does that work?
Think about our comparison again. SVO languages, like English, often support a quick back and forth, almost like a debate. Speaker A says their piece early, listener B gets the main idea fast and can jump in with agreement, disagreement, their own point.
Yeah, interruptions are pretty normal. Sometimes helpful, sometimes not.
You're right, the structure allows for, even encourages, that quick response. But in SOV Japanese, because that crucial verb, the action, the punchline, is held way back, the listener simply can't know the full meaning until the sentence is totally finished.
They literally don't know what happened yet.
Exactly. Let's use that detailed example from the source again. Watashi wa ayare kino no yoru, last night,
Yeah.
tomodachi to, with a friend, eki no chikaku de, near the station.
Okay, last night with a friend near the station, and I'm hanging there, waiting. What did you do?
Precisely. You've got the who, when, with whom, where. But the what is missing. Was it .aimashita, met?
No.
Or maybe .wakerimashita, parted ways.
Right.
Or .hanashimashita, talked. Or even an kenka shimashita, had a fight. The entire meaning pivots on that final verb.
Wow. So the possibilities are wide open until the last syllable.
Absolutely. And here's the critical implication for listening. Because you don't know the meaning, you can't really interrupt meaningfully mid-sentence. Or, more accurately, the cultural norm strongly discourages it. You'd be cutting the speaker off before they've even delivered their core message.
You have to wait. You're forced to listen all the way through.
You really are. And this posture, this patient, attentive listening, holding all the context until the final word clarifies everything this is highlighted in our source, is a fundamental characteristic cultivated by the language. It takes real effort for non-native speakers to get used to it. It trains a specific kind of listening muscle.
That waiting, that required patience. It makes me think about silence. Another person in the source mentioned learning Japanese gave them a new respect for silence. How does silence fit into this?
That's a really perceptive connection. That observation about respecting silence is deeply tied to this listening culture. The learner felt that in their native tongue, there was pressure to fill pauses, that silence felt awkward.
Yeah, we often feel we need to jump in.
Right. But learning Japanese taught them to hold back, to actually sit in the silence and use that space to try and understand what the other person might be feeling or thinking, even if they weren't saying anything. It wasn't just about language. It changed how they related to people.
So the silence isn't empty, it's active.
Exactly. Japanese culture has this concept, ma. It's the space, the interval, the pause between words or actions. And crucially, ma isn't seen as just a void. It's meaningful. It's time built into the conversation for the listener to receive the other person's feelings, to sense the resonance of the words, to, read the air.
So silence is part of the message itself, not just absence of sound.
Precisely. It's active, meaningful silence, which can be quite different from some Western views where silence might feel like tension or failure in communication, that fear of silence. In Japanese interaction, ma is part of the narrative. It's speaking by not speaking, conveying things through the pause. Linguists are actually studying this more and more.
And does this focus on listening, on ma, actually affect relationships tangibly?
According to the source material, yes, quite significantly. It points to surveys where foreigners who learned Japanese reported real improvements in their relationships, both personal and professional.
Oh, so?
They found they interrupted less. They learned to wait before jumping in with their own thoughts. They started trying to imagine the background, the unsaid things behind the words. They felt they'd unconsciously become more empathetic listeners.
Wow. That's a powerful side effect of learning a language, developing empathy skills.
It really is.
Yeah.
A psychology expert quoted in the source puts it very clearly. The Japanese conversational structure, with its reliance on context, implication, and the verb last pattern, basically requires a premise of respecting the other person's space and thought process to work smoothly. It's a language built to give room to the other.
So the daily grammar reinforces a kind of relational etiquette.
You could absolutely see it that way. It functions as a cultural intelligence that values the relationship, embeds meaning in silence, and considers the other person implicitly. This listening culture is something the source suggests is increasingly valuable in our often loud and interruptive world.
It definitely feels like something we could use more of. Okay, switching gears a little, but it feels connected. The source brings up something really surprising about artificial intelligence.
Ah, yes. The AI challenge.
Right. AI is getting amazing with language summarizing, translating, even writing, but apparently Japanese is really, really hard for it. Why?
It's a fantastic point because it highlights what's so uniquely, well, human about Japanese structure. You're right. AI capabilities are exploding.
You'd think it could just crunch the grammar rules.
Logically, yes. But developers working on the cutting edge find Japanese notoriously difficult. They hit roadblocks they don't see as much with, say, English or other SVO languages.
Why? Is it just the verb being last again?
That's a huge part of it, but it's layered with other things. See, AI models are often designed for and trained heavily on SVO languages. Subject and verb appear early, giving the AI clear structural anchors. It can predict sentence structure, guess the meaning relatively easily.
He gets a foothold quickly.
Exactly. Now, Japanese, SOV, verb is last, big delay. Plus, remember how Japanese often drops the subject and sometimes the object if it's clear from context?
Right. Like yesterday at the station, saw.
Precisely. Ki no eki de mikaketa. Who saw whom? Grammatically, it's ambiguous within the sentence itself. The meaning relies entirely on the verb ending, and critically, the shared context outside the sentence. Who's talking? What were they just discussing?
So the AI has to juggle all these possibilities, wait until the end, and maybe even look back at the previous conversation to figure it out.
That's the core problem. For AI, which loves clear rules and predictable patterns, this constant delay of information combined with inherent ambiguity is a nightmare. It struggles to keep all potential meanings active throughout a long sentence and then make the right call based on subtle cues or missing information that humans just infer. It's a massive processing load compared to SVO.
It's like the AI is waiting for the punchline, but it's also missing half the setup and doesn't know the characters involved.
That's a perfect analogy. And underlying this is what the source calls the intelligence of ambiguity in Japanese. There's often a cultural preference not to spell everything out explicitly, leaving space, relying on the listener's intuition and ability to read the air.
And AI definitely cannot read the air. It needs data points.
Exactly right. One AI developer is quoted saying, AI hits a wall because understanding Japanese often requires reading the air. Syntax alone isn't sufficient. So in a way, Japanese is just too human for current logic-based AI.
Too human. So the difficulty for AI actually highlights how deeply relational and context-driven the language is.
In a very real sense, yes. The verb-last structure, the implied subjects, the meaning packed into endings, the role of silence, it all fits human intuition, how we use tone, expression, shared history. That waiting period for the verb isn't just grammatical, it's part of the human interaction, building trust, maybe empathy, in ways AI can't grasp.
It's not just data transfer, it's managing the relationship during the transfer.
Absolutely. Think about those vague Japanese phrases like chotto, a little. Grammatically, it means almost nothing specific, but culturally it can mean, no thank you, that's difficult. Excuse me, depending entirely on context and tone. It's used to soften potentially awkward interactions.
So, well, you know.
Right, which can signal anything from reluctant agreement to gentle disagreement. AI can't translate the function of these phrases because the meaning isn't in the words. It's in how they're used to navigate the relationship delicately. Japanese seems designed for this careful adjustment of relationships.
So it's a language optimized for human connection, not just data efficiency.
That seems to be the core argument. And the AI struggle becomes proof of that. In an age pushing for optimization, Japanese reminds us of these uniquely human qualities: space, warmth, nuance, still alive in language. That listening culture, the not rushing to speak, these become even more precious.
It really reframes the whole thing. Okay, so it feels like this verb-last structure isn't just a linguistic quirk. It's tied to a whole different approach to communication, thinking, relationships. Is the rest of the world starting to notice this, maybe learn from it?
Yes, there's definitely a shift happening. Maybe slow, but it's noticeable. Historically, as we said, Western linguistic views often prize that SVO directness clear, logical, fast. Language is structured that way. We're sometimes seen as more advanced or civilized.
That bias is fading.
It seems to be. There's a growing realization across different fields, philosophy, psychology, education, even business, that maybe rushing to the conclusion isn't always best, that there's value, maybe even deeper wisdom, in not speaking immediately, in creating space, in truly listening first.
And the source gives concrete examples of this being recognized.
It does. One really compelling example is from education overseas. Reports from places like a U.S. elementary school where kids learning Japanese started changing how they interacted in all their classes.
Really? How?
Teachers noticed these kids became better listeners. They were less likely to interrupt, more willing to wait for classmates to finish speaking. The language training seemed to be subtly changing their whole attitude towards dialogue. It wasn't just about Japanese, it was about interaction itself.
Wow. Learning the grammar changed their social skills.
It appears so. It suggests that this listening culture, which Japanese speakers often learn implicitly through the language, isn't just a cultural trait. It might be a universally valuable skill, especially now when discourse can be so polarized and quick to react.
It embodies that idea. Accept the other person first, then respond.
Exactly. Don't give your answer immediately. Don't rush to assert. Carefully prepare the context. Value the space before the conclusion. This approach, the source argues, leads towards empathy, not conflict.
And the foreign businessman's story illustrates this personally.
Yes, his story is very touching. He said learning Japanese made him consciously try to listen first in all his conversations, work negotiations, family talks. He realized how many arguments or misunderstandings came from just jumping to conclusions without hearing the other person out fully, without waiting for their complete sentence.
He saw the verb last principle in action everywhere.
He did, and the fact that this powerful listening culture seemed rooted in the very grammar the verb last rule profoundly affected him. He saw learning Japanese not just as skill acquisition, but as learning a practical technique for rebuilding human connection.
A technique for empathy baked into the language structure. That's just fascinating.
It really is. And it's not just feelings. The source note, Cognitive Science, is exploring this too. Some research suggests SVO processing might lean towards quick analytical judgment, while SOV processing might encourage more holistic, integrative, context-aware thinking. It reinforces this idea that Japanese word order isn't arbitrary. It's like a design philosophy for building relationships.
It is truly amazing that such a seemingly simple grammatical rule, just putting the verb at the end of the sentence, can unveil such a deep, nuanced, and almost philosophical world of communication, thought, and relationship.
It is, isn't it? It's a powerful reminder that language is so much more than just transmitting data. In a world that often feels saturated with information, constantly demanding speed and instant reactions, Japanese, through its quiet structure, seems to teach something really valuable.
Which is?
It requires, and therefore helps cultivate, the courage not to speak immediately, the courage to hold back, and maybe even more importantly, the kindness to wait until the end, until the other person has fully delivered their thought, their context, their conclusion.
So delaying the conclusion isn't inefficiency, it's a kind of strength, a relational strength.
Exactly. It's the strength needed to truly receive the other person's message in its entirety, to absorb the context they're building, and to let the connection deepen in that shared space of waiting and understanding that finally arrives with the verb. And this strength, this quiet intelligence, isn't loud or boastful, it's just there, subtly woven into the very fabric of the word order. There's a kindness, maybe, in the silence just before the final words. There's a trust embedded in the time spent waiting until the end of the sentence. This structure, putting the verb last, which seems so strange at first, really is a kind of quiet intelligence, and it seems the world is slowly starting to recognize its value and perhaps learn from it.
That leaves us with a lot to think about. So maybe the question for you, the listener, is this. How much of our own way of communicating how quickly we speak, how patiently we listen, is just a habit formed by the structure of the language we use every day? And thinking about Japanese, could consciously embracing some of its underlying spirit, that value placed on waiting, on silence, on context, on really hearing the other person out before responding, could that help us all become better listeners, better communicators, maybe just better connected humans, regardless of the language we speak?
A powerful thought to carry forward.
See you next time on Mimi and Pico TV.